Part 2. With a bubbling wail, the Vekung warrior lunged at the intruder, falling down upon the rider from above. A dozen of his tribesmen took up the war cry, leaping down from the sides of the crystal spires, the iron fingers of their gloves shimmering weirdly in the moonlight, crystalline dust coating their metal talons like diseased lizards. The Vekung had crawled up the crystal spires, gouging handholds into the living mineral with their claws. They watched from the heights as the stranger penetrated deeper into their lands, as the strange wolf like beast lopped through the shard like sand. The first attack had been butchery. The hunters slaughtered nearly to a man by this eerie invader. Their carcasses were strewn through the silent canyons. Mangled and torn by blade and fang, the stranger's black sword had been remorseless as the elements, carving a swath of blood across the desert. The jaws and claws of his ghastly steed had been no less deadly, spilling entrails and snapping spines with every swipe of its immense paws, crushing bodies with every flick of its powerful tail. The hunter's weapons had broken against the armor of the warrior, splintering like rotten sticks against dark plates. Wherever they attacked, however, carefully they laid their ambush. The stranger was ready for them, almost seeming to welcome the chance to kill. From mazes, from mazes of mirror that would have confused even a demon's twisted mind, the Wei Kung had struck again and again, only to have their attacks falter and fail, waves crashing around the uncaring shore. At last, the few hunters remaining had broken, fleeing back to their burrows to warn the rest of their tribe. Their cowardice earned them death beneath the sacred talons of the crow god. Only the warning they carried allowed them any trace of honor, as the shaman's chain whips flayed their flesh from their bones. They had found a foe too deadly to overcome. But if the invader thought the men he had slaughtered represented the strength of the Vet Kung, he was sorely mistaken. Scores of warriors, each a hand and a half taller than the degenerate hunters, each armored in plates of reptilian hide boiled to the toughness of bronze, each bearing blades of iron, emerged from the darkness of the tunnels to answer the intruder's challenge. The first of the hung warriors came crashing down against the rider, knocking him from his bronze saddle. The two men struck the ground in a cloud of shimmering dust. Other warriors hurtled earthwards, their iron weapons slashing at the wolfish steed. The brute spun and howled as they hit it, gouging deep wounds in its shaggy hide. Warriors were sent reeling as the beast's massive paws struck them, slashing through their scaly armor as though it weren't there. The barbed tail cracked like a whip behind the creature, knocking men into the shard sand with each lash of its brutal length. One Vekung, bolder than the rest, landed upon the brute's back, trying to stab its skull with a rusty curve of its sword. The blade cracked against the monster's horns, notching it as it struck the impossibly thick bones. Before the warrior could recover, the beast twisted its head around, sinking its jaws into his leg. With a savage jerk, the wolf beast ripped the man from its back, pitching him to the ground. Even as he started to rise, the beast pounced on him, collapsing his chest beneath its tremendous weight. Teeth bared at the warrior, still prowling around its flanks. The monster brought one paw smashing down into the squirming thing pinned beneath it, flattening his victim's head in a mass of brain and bone. The shimmering dust that had claimed the Vet Kung champion and his prey slowly settled. One figure stood, his dark armor dripping with shining sand and putrid gore, his black blade drenched in the blood of his foe, his clawed gauntlet locked around the slimy wetness of his enemy's throat. At his feet, the rest of the Hung's body shivered in a mire of its own filth. The intruder's eyes glared at the other Vet Kung warriors from behind the steel mask of his helm. There was contempt in his silence, contempt in the way he tossed the torn flesh of their hero aside. A hungry wail pulsed through the night as the smoldering malignancy of the killer's sword shuddered in his hand. A tremor of fear ran through the ranks of the Vet Kung warriors. The invader seemed to savor their terror as he marched towards them, murderous blade at the ready. Fear fired the Wei Kung warriors, filling their brutal hearts with such bitter shame that even thoughts of death and butchery could not hold them back. The diseased fighters roared from behind the beaked visage of their bone helms, their voices loathsome and foul. A dozen stalked away from the circle of iron that had grown around the embattled wolf beast, leaving only a handful of their fellows to keep the brute at bay. The stranger did not wait for his enemies to charge, but lunged into their midst even as they approached him. The black sword swept down, crunching through rotten armor and putrid flesh, carving its gruesome path through tainted flesh and corrupted bone. One Wei Kung fell back, screaming, clutching at the spurting stump of his arm. A second fell, his body cleft from crown to collar. A third, trying to strike at the rushing killer, was caught in the sweet, steely grip of his foe's hand. With a wrenching twist, the killer broke the Hung's arm, driving his own pitted blade back into the warrior's chest. From above, a pair of Wei Kung sprang at the invader, dropping from their handholds in the crystal spires. The strange killer spun as he heard them utter their bubbling war cries. The black sword swept through the moonlight, its metaphytic smoke streaming behind it. Cries turned into liquid groans as the demon steel chopped through the hurtling figures, splashing their wreckage across the shard sand. The intruder turned away from the dissected human debris, lashing out at the warriors who had thought to exploit the distraction. Screams pierced the night as a leg was cut from its body, a head shorn from its shoulders, and an arm ripped from its socket. Corroded swords crashed against the darkened armor, buckling and snapping as they futilely sought weaknesses in the unyielding mail. Weaponless, stunned warriors backed away, broken swords dropping from slackened fingers. Now they were at the stranger's mercy. He showed them none. The death rattles of the hung warriors rose in a strangled chorus, pawing at the shimmering spires as they faded into night. The armored killer waded through the slaughter, an engine of butchery, sparing none in his path. The great wolf beast entered the battle alongside its master, aiding its primitive savagery to the massacre. When the last Wei Kung fell, the monstrous creature threw back its head, its massive frame shaking as a thunderous howl of triumph echoed across the desert. The lone killer did not savor the massacre as he stalked among the dead. Pacing through the mire of the battlefield, there was an expectant, brooding quality to his movements, like a panther waiting for its prey. Again and again he circled the carnage, giving no notice to the dying things that littered the ground, waiting for what would come, waiting for what he had come here to kill. The stranger froze suddenly as he circled the dead. He turned his face from the battlefield, eyes boring into the shadows between the crystal spires. Long he watched the black valley as slowly sound crawled from the gloom. The heavy tread of marching feet, crunching through the shard sand. A rancid green glow began to banish the darkness, a sickly light that caused the facets of the spires to smoke as it fell upon them. A shape slowly manifested within the green light, a great palanquin of bronze and sinew, borne upon the shoulders of a dozen scrawny, stumbling figures. By degrees, the stranger could see that they were youths, their leprous flesh pitted by the marks of the plague and decay. They watched him with cold, feverish eyes, set far into the pits of their near fleshless skulls. Above the laboring wretches upon the sides of the palanquin, braziers of corroded metal smoldered and smoked, giving off the pestilential glow. Basking in the glow, sprawled upon the cushioned seat of the carriage, was an oozing bulk, more toad than man. The thing's pallid flesh stood naked beneath the stars, covered only in welts, boils, and lesions, its entire mass marked with thousands of tiny pox wounds that wept slime and filth across the thing's enormity. Hairless and swollen, the thing's flabby head grinned down at the stranger. Almost absently, it raised a chubby hand to its great antlers that jutted from its face. pulling at strips of decaying meat impaled upon the horns. A tongue, the color of scum and stagnation, flicked from the thing's ghastly maw, snatching maggots from the rotting flesh with its tiny mouth of its own. "You killed my hunters," the bloated creature said, the sound wheezing from the obesity like a gargle of a drowned whale. "You killed my warriors," it said, brushing a worm from its cheek. "You invade my lands, a place sacred to the great crow god." There was no hint of anger in the jovial croak, only a subdued amusement. The palanquin creaked as the litter bearer struggled, as the thing leaned forward, letting the brown pits of its eyes focus more closely upon the lone warrior. The haughty smile spread impossibly wide across its flabby visage. "Don't blame yourself. I applaud the audacity of such madness." The thing's stumpy hands clapped together, like sides of raw beef. "How are you called, madman?" "The crow god will be pleased when I offer up your flesh to him." The stranger stood silent, a grim shadow among the carnage of the battlefield. The face of the fat warlord twitched in annoyance. More than the slaughter of his minions, more than the invasion of his lands, even more than the blasphemy against his god, he found this stranger's discourtesy upsetting. He looked at a second strip of meat, oozing back into his throne. "I am Bleda Carrion Crown," the bulk announced, with a slimy burp. "Khan of the Vekong, master of the desert of Mears, chosen of the crow god, tabernacle of the divine rot." The grotesque warlord shifted his tremendous mass, his flabby hands closing around a strange weapon dangling from the arm of his throne. It was sections of metal rod connected by rusty links of chain. 7 in number, each rod was pitted and foul with decay, dripping with some internal corruption. "This is my chain of 70 plagues," Bleda said, caressing the weapon with obscene fervor. "No man has ever stood against it. And I ask again, who are you and where do you come from? Is it the Van who have dared such foolishness? The Sul? Surely not the Savage. What people spurred you into this madness? For I would favor them with my prayers to mighty Neglin." The skull-masked stranger shook his head, staring at the swollen bulk of Bleda. "A steel rain has come to cleanse with blood and terror." His voice rasped, the slither of sword against sheath. For an instant, fear flared within Bleda's rancid eyes. As he heard the stranger's spectral voice, he saw the warrior stalk forward. His hand shivered against his oily flesh, clutching at his throat in alarm. Beneath his fingers he could feel the pox runes of Neglin. The touch of his own afflictions reassured him. Was he not the chosen of his god? Did not the power of Neglin course through him? Bleda's laughter bubbled up from deep within his corrupt bulk. "Thy name is then, fool," the Khan croaked, like a sea beast floundering upon the shore. He surged up from the throne, waddling down the 7 steps that fronted his palanquin. The ground seemed to cringe beneath him as his feet sank into the shard sand. Beneath him, Bleda slaves set down the heavy palanquin and formed a leprous mass around their warlord. "You speak of rain and blood and terror. You wear the skull rune of corn? Fool! This is a desert where it has not rained since before the days of Teocte, blood and terror. Here they belong to one man, and one man alone, Bleda of the Vekong. This is the sacred land of Neglin, where the blood god has no part."